The Lost Epoch. Unexplained gaps in human history. History, in the way we usually understand it, is meant to unfold in a continuous flow. One society rises upon the remnants of another. Knowledge builds layer upon layer. Advancement keeps moving ahead. We learn agriculture. Then we establish cities. Then we develop writing. Then we construct empires. A clean, orderly progression from the simple to the complex, from cave art to grand cathedrals to towering skyscrapers. But that is not truly how events unfolded. When you take a closer look at the historical record, when you genuinely study the evidence available to us, something deeply unsettling begins to appear. There are gaps, vast, unaccounted-for gaps, entire centuries where flourishing civilizations simply disappear from the archaeological record. Periods where human development doesn't just slow, it comes to a complete halt. Sometimes it even reverses direction. Highly advanced societies collapse in what seems like an instant, and those who come after live for generations among the ruins, unable to comprehend the technologies their ancestors once mastered. These are not merely missing pages in a book of history. They are whole chapters ripped out, entire eras where we have no clear understanding of what happened to millions of people. Where did they go? What were they doing? How did they manage to survive? And most troubling of all, why did so many fail to survive at all? The Bronze Age kingdoms around the Mediterranean did not fade away gradually. They vanished within a single generation. The Western Roman Empire fell, and Europe descended into centuries where even the knowledge of building with stone was lost. Great cities in the Americas were abandoned, overtaken by jungle, their people dispersing to unknown destinations. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the largest urban societies of the ancient world, disappeared so thoroughly that even 4,500 years later, we still cannot decipher their writing. These are the shadows that lie between the lines of history, the dark voids where our timeline fractures and the narrative ceases to make sense. Now, if you are listening to this video to drift off to sleep, that is exactly why I create them. So, maybe subscribe and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is. I always read the comments, and it is fascinating to see Berlin at breakfast and Boston at bedtime, all at once, all of us thinking about the same mysteries. What makes these gaps so compelling is this: we possess tangible proof that these civilizations once existed. We can observe their ruins, their artifacts, sometimes even their preserved remains. And then, without warning, the evidence simply ends. It's like coming across someone's journal with 50 pages torn out right in the middle of the most crucial section. Consider the archaeological evidence from the late Bronze Age. For hundreds of years, we observe signs of trade networks extending across thousands of miles, advanced metalworking, complex writing systems, and diplomatic exchanges between powerful kingdoms. Then, around 1200 BCE, nearly all of it disappears, not just in a single region, but across dozens of locations at the same time throughout the Mediterranean and the Near East. Cities were set ablaze, trade routes deserted, writing systems abandoned. For the next 400 years, the historical record becomes almost entirely silent. Or think about pre-dynastic Egypt. We know the Great Pyramids were constructed around BCE, but the society that built them must have spent centuries developing the knowledge, mathematics, and organizational abilities required to create such monumental structures. Yet when we search for evidence of that developmental phase, we find almost nothing. It is as though the Egyptians moved from small agricultural villages to flawlessly engineered megastructures with almost no gradual transition. These gaps are not only puzzling, they are unsettling, even haunting. They remind us of how delicate our own civilization may be, how quickly knowledge can vanish, how easily complexity can collapse into disorder, and how close we always are to losing everything we believe we understand. Tonight, we are going to explore these shadows, the centuries that seem to have swallowed entire civilizations. We will journey through the Eastern Mediterranean during its mysterious collapse into the European Dark Ages, where literacy itself nearly disappeared. We will travel to the pre-Columbian Americas, where entire cultures rose and fell without leaving written accounts. We will examine the Indus Valley, where a civilization of millions left behind cities but no clear explanations. We will trace the lost past of sub-Saharan Africa, deliberately erased by those who came later. We will follow the Pacific navigators who settled thousands of islands only to fade into oral tradition. We will look into the obscure centuries before ancient Egypt became Egypt, and we will end at the Younger Dryas, 12,000 years ago, when a global catastrophe may have erased civilizations we may never even know existed. There is something strangely calming about these mysteries. Unlike the chaos of present-day events, these questions have been waiting for thousands of years. They will still be there tomorrow. There is no urgency, no deadline, only the quiet comfort of knowing that history is far more complex and incomplete than we often admit. So settle in. Let the questions drift over you, and let us step together into the shadows between history, where entire civilizations linger in the darkness, hoping someone will remember that they once existed. Imagine the Eastern Mediterranean in the 12th and 25 BC. This was the height of human civilization, the most interconnected, advanced, and intricate world humanity had ever created. The Egyptian New Kingdom ruled along the Nile, with monuments that would still stand 3,000 years later. The Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia with disciplined armies and administrative precision. Mycenaean Greece thrived with palaces filled with gold and warriors whose stories would later echo through Homer's epics. The Minoans traded from their island stronghold of Crete. The Canaanites and their Phoenician successors sailed across the Mediterranean, linking all these civilizations through trade networks that stretched from Afghanistan to Spain. Cities such as Ugarit, Attusa, Mycenae, and Pylos were major urban centers by ancient standards, some home to tens of thousands of people. They possessed advanced writing systems, complex bureaucracies, skilled artisans, and professional military forces. They traded tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus, amber from the Baltic, and ivory from Africa. Their vessels transported wine, olive oil, fabrics, perfumes, and weapons. Their diplomatic letters, composed in Akkadian, the English of the Bronze Age world, reveal a level of international diplomacy that would not be equaled again for more than 1,000 years. And then, within perhaps 50 years, between 1,200 and 1,150 BCE, everything unraveled. Not a slow decline, not a gradual evolution, an outright collapse. Cities were set ablaze, palaces left empty, trade routes disintegrated, systems of writing vanished, and populations sharply declined. The highly developed international world of the late Bronze Age simply stopped existing. This was nothing like the fall of Rome, which unfolded over centuries and left behind successor states that preserved aspects of Roman culture. This was sudden, devastating, and nearly universal across the Eastern Mediterranean. Within a single human lifetime, civilization went dark, and it remained in darkness for 400 years. What the archaeological evidence reveals is deeply unsettling. layer upon layer of destruction across dozens of sites. The Hittite capital burned so intensely that limestone walls were vitrified. The palace at Pylos in Greece shows signs of frantic defensive preparations just before it was destroyed. Ugarit, one of the great commercial centers of the ancient world, was so completely ruined that it was never rebuilt. The palace at Knossos in Crete, the heart of Minoan civilization, was abandoned. Troy the Seventh was destroyed. Megiddo in Canaan was destroyed. Hazor was destroyed. Ashkelon was destroyed. The list continues. More than 40 major settlements show evidence of violent destruction during this time, not spread across centuries, but concentrated within just a few decades around 1200 BCE. Something catastrophic swept through the Bronze Age world like a massive wave, crushing everything in its path. But what is truly troubling is this: we do not know what caused it. Or more precisely, we have too many possible explanations and not enough evidence to determine which is correct. Because the Bronze Age collapse did not only destroy cities, it erased the capacity to record what happened. When writing systems disappeared, so too did the historical accounts that might have explained the catastrophe. The most well-known theory involves the Sea Peoples. They appear in Egyptian inscriptions around 1200 BCE as a coalition of raiders and invaders arriving from the islands in the midst of the sea. Pharaoh Ramesses III confronted them in a massive naval battle around 1175 BCE and claimed victory. But even Egypt emerged weakened. His temple records describe them as a terrifying force that had already destroyed the Hittite Empire and several other kingdoms before reaching the borders of Egypt. But who were the Sea Peoples? The Egyptian records list names the Peliset, the Tijaker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. Some researchers suggest the Peliset later became the Philistines. Perhaps the Shekelesh were Sicilians. The Denyen might have been the Danans, the Greeks mentioned by Homer. But these are only hypotheses based on similarities in names written in hieroglyphs 3,200 years ago. We do not know where they originated, what language they spoke, or even whether they were a single unified group or simply a convenient Egyptian label for various northern raiders. More troubling still, we do not know whether they caused the collapse or were themselves a consequence of it. Because here is the critical point. The Sea Peoples appear in the historical record after many of the major destructions had already taken place. Hattusa, burned before Ramesses III, fought his great naval battle. The Mycenaean palaces had already been destroyed or abandoned. So were the Sea Peoples responsible for destroying civilizations, or were they displaced populations fleeing already collapsed society, desperately searching for new lands in a world that was falling apart? Some archaeologists argue that climate change was the primary cause. Paleoclimate evidence shows a significant drought across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Tree ring studies from ancient wood reveal reduced growth. Pollen records indicate declining rainfall. Lake levels dropped throughout the region. For Bronze Age societies that relied on agriculture to sustain dense urban populations, prolonged drought could have been devastating. Crop failures would have led to famine. Famine would have triggered social instability. Desperate communities might have turned to raiding. Trade systems dependent on surplus production would have collapsed. This explanation seems reasonable until you consider that Bronze Age civilizations had endured droughts before. Egypt, in particular, had developed advanced systems to manage Nile flooding and cope with periods of scarcity. The idea that climate change alone caused the collapse does not fully account for the speed and totality of the destruction. Droughts typically lead to gradual decline, not the sudden and widespread devastation we see in the archaeological record. Others point instead to systemic collapse. The Bronze Age world was highly interconnected. Those trade systems that once appeared to be sources of strength were, at the same time, points of weakness. When producing bronze weapons and tools required tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus, entire societies depended on stable trade routes stretching across vast distances. When an economy became specialized in exporting goods like wine and olive oil, it also meant relying on imported grain for survival. When palace administrations grew so intricate that dozens of scribes were needed simply to record and manage inventory, that complexity itself became a liability in times of disruption. It is best imagined as a house of cards. Each civilization supported the others through exchange, royal marriages, and military alliances. The entire system remained balanced only as long as every component held its place. But if one major power collapsed, the chain reaction could be catastrophic. If the Hittites fell, their partners suddenly lost access to essential materials. If trade routes became dangerous because of raiders, specialized economies unraveled. If the collapse of one region sent waves of refugees into neighboring lands, those areas could become unstable as well. The same complexity that had made Bronze Age civilization so remarkable also made it extremely fragile. The signs of systemic collapse are striking. They appear clearly in surviving administrative records. The Linear B tablets from Mycenaean Greece, preserved by the fires that destroyed the palaces, reveal bureaucracies desperately attempting to manage resources under what seem to be crisis conditions. Allocations of bronze are recorded down to the smallest unit. Lists of rowers being conscripted point to urgent military threats. The final tablets from Pylos refer to coastal watchers, suggesting an expectation of attacks coming from the sea. And then, abruptly, the tablets end. Linear B, the writing system of Mycenaean Greece, vanished entirely. It would not be deciphered again until 1952. For 400 years, Greece existed without any writing system at all. The advanced palace administration, the meticulous records, the sophisticated logistics that had sustained Mycenaean society, all of it disappeared. And not just for a short time, it vanished so completely that later generations of Greeks had no memory that writing had ever existed. When writing was eventually reintroduced through the Phoenician alphabet centuries later, they had to begin again from the very beginning. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so deeply unsettling. It was not merely a shift in political power, it was a massive cultural regression. Population levels dropped dramatically. Some estimates indicate that Greece lost as much as 80% of its population between 1200 and 1000 BCE. Cities were abandoned as people returned to small farming communities. Monumental building projects came to a halt. Pottery designs became simpler. Metallurgical knowledge was lost. International trade almost entirely ceased. The world effectively shrank. A once interconnected Bronze Age civilization that had linked 3 continents was replaced by isolated villages whose inhabitants knew little of what lay beyond their immediate surroundings. The historical record reflects this growing isolation. Egyptian pharaohs, who had once corresponded with rulers across the known world, were now focused mainly on local matters. The great diplomatic archives, such as the Amarna letters, which reveal the Bronze Age world at its height, have no equivalent after 1200 BCE, simply because there was no one left to correspond with. What makes this even more haunting is the scale of what was permanently lost. Much of what Bronze Age civilization achieved will never be known, because the collapse destroyed not only the societies themselves, but also the records of their accomplishments. Libraries were burned, oral traditions were disrupted as populations scattered. Technologies vanished when the specialists who understood them died without passing on their knowledge. Consider writing systems. The linear A script of the Minoans remains undeciphered. The Luwian hieroglyphs of Anatolia are still only partially understood. Other writing systems that may have existed in Mycenaean outposts across the Mediterranean were lost entirely. Even in regions where writing continued, such as Egypt, the collapse introduced gaps. Egyptian chronology becomes uncertain. Historical records are incomplete. Pieces of the story that might explain what happened are missing. The collapse was not uniform across all regions. Some areas were affected more severely than others. Cyprus suffered devastation but recovered relatively quickly. The Phoenician cities along the Levantine coast survived and eventually expanded their trade networks westward, founding Carthage. Egypt endured, though in a weakened state. But the Hittite Empire vanished completely. Mycenaean civilization came to an end. The great cities of the Syrian coast were destroyed. In these places, the Bronze Age did not simply conclude, it was erased so thoroughly that its memory became the subject of legend. When recovery finally began, it took centuries. Greece remained in its dark age until around 800 BCE, when writing was reintroduced and population levels began to rise again. Yet the classical Greek civilization that later emerged was fundamentally different from the Mycenaean world that came before it. Its political structures, religious practices, and economic systems were all transformed. The centralized palace economies, with their complex bureaucracies, gave way to smaller, independent city-states. The once great palaces survived only in stories about figures like Agamemnon and the Trojan war tales that later Greeks believed might be purely mythical, until archaeological discoveries revealed that Troy and Mycenae were real. What makes the Bronze Age collapse so relevant today is how modern those ancient societies were in certain ways. They existed within a deeply interconnected global system. They engaged in international diplomacy, negotiated trade conflicts, and maintained intricate supply networks. They constructed civilizations that appeared enduring, structures and societies that had persisted for centuries. And then, everything unraveled with such speed that those who remained could not fully account for what had taken place. Because here lies the uncomfortable reality. We still do not know the primary cause. Was it the sea peoples? Climate change? A systemic collapse? A sequence of earthquakes? The emergence of new weapons that rendered traditional military strategies ineffective? Or was it a combination of all these pressures? The academic discussions persist precisely because the evidence remains unclear. Different regions reveal different patterns of destruction and abandonment. Some locations show clear signs of seismic damage. Others bear the marks of being burned in warfare. Still others appear to have been deserted without violence, as though the inhabitants simply departed. What we do understand is that when multiple stresses strike at once, even highly advanced civilizations can collapse in catastrophic ways. The Bronze Age world might have endured drought, or raiders, or political instability, but all of them together, cascading through interconnected systems, proved overwhelming. The entire structure gave way, like a house of cards collapsing. And when it did, humanity lost 400 years. 4 centuries in which populations shrank, technologies were forgotten, writing disappeared, and trade networks disintegrated. 4 centuries of decline, during which the descendants of Bronze Age societies struggled to survive in a world that had become darker, smaller, and more dangerous. 4 centuries that left almost no written trace, only layers of destruction in the archaeological record and stories preserved through oral tradition. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that civilization is more fragile than we tend to believe, that complexity brings vulnerability as well as strength, that the systems we build to connect us can also amplify our failures, and that sometimes, despite every effort to preserve and document, entire eras of human achievement can simply vanish, leaving behind only ruins and unanswered questions for future generations to contemplate. When the light finally returned, when Greece emerged from its dark age, when writing reappeared and civilization began to rebuild, the world had been fundamentally transformed. The Bronze Age was gone, and with it disappeared knowledge, technologies, and records that can never be recovered. Somewhere within those lost centuries lie answers to questions we can no longer even frame, stories that will never be told, accomplishments that will never be remembered, all extinguished within the span of a single human lifetime, lost within the shadows between history. Imagine this: Rome, 476 CE. The greatest empire the Western world had ever known simply comes to an end. Not with a dramatic explosion, not with a final apocalyptic battle, but with a quiet fading. The last Western Roman emperor, a teenage boy bearing the ironic name Romulus Augustulus, is quietly pensioned off by a Germanic general. And just like that, 5 centuries of Roman dominance are over. But what makes this moment so peculiar is that the cities are still intact. The roads still stretch across Europe like a vast stone spiderweb. The aqueducts continue to carry water. The libraries still contain thousands of scrolls. Everything remains in place, except for the people who knew how to maintain it, except for the administrative systems that held it together, except for the literate class capable of reading and preserving knowledge. Within a generation, perhaps 2, it all begins to fall apart, not destroyed, but abandoned and forgotten. And for the next 500 to 600 years, Europe descends into what we now call the Dark Ages. Yet no one living at that time used that term. No one realized they were in a dark age. They were simply trying to survive. Now, here is something important about the Dark Ages. The name itself is controversial. Modern historians tend to dislike it. They prefer terms like early medieval period or late antiquity, and they have a valid point. The label, Dark Ages, was coined by Renaissance scholars who looked back at this time and saw only ignorance and barbarism. They compared it to the height of Rome and found it lacking. But that comparison is unfair. It is like observing a forest regrowing after a wildfire and calling it dark simply because it has not yet reached its former height. Yet there is another reason the term still feels appropriate, one that has nothing to do with judgment. These centuries are literally dark to us. We can barely see into them. The written record does not merely decline. In some regions, it almost disappears entirely. We go from hundreds of documents each decade to perhaps 1 or 2 in an entire century. Archaeological evidence becomes limited and difficult to interpret. Material culture becomes so simplified that accurately dating sites becomes a challenge. We are not just observing a period of decline. We are confronting a time in which our ability to understand what was happening nearly collapses altogether. It is as if someone suddenly switched off the lights inside the archive of history. So, what truly took place? How could the most recorded, most bureaucratic, and most literate civilization in the Western world simply lose the ability to read and write within only a few generations? The brief explanation is that the entire structure supporting literacy collapsed. But the deeper explanation is far more fascinating and far more unsettling. Rome was not merely an empire. It functioned as a machine, an enormous interconnected system in which every component relied on the others. Cities depended on grain shipments from North Africa. The army depended on taxes collected from those cities. The roads required maintenance crews funded by the army. Everything operated through constant motion. Goods circulating, people traveling, information spreading. When Rome fell, the machine did not simply shut down. It began to operate in reverse. Cities that relied on imported grain started to shrink. As they shrank, they produced less tax revenue. With less revenue, roads could no longer be maintained. As roads deteriorated, trade became increasingly difficult. As trade declined, cities shrank even more. It was a downward spiral, and it unfolded rapidly. Within 100 years after Rome's collapse, most major cities in Europe had lost between 80 to 90% of their population. Not primarily because people were dying, although many were, but because urban life became unsustainable when grain shipments ceased and aqueducts could no longer be maintained. People moved into the countryside, where they could grow their own food and rely on wells for water. And when people left the cities, literacy disappeared along with them. Because what many people fail to understand about literacy in the ancient world is that it was not valued for its own sake. You did not learn to read and write because knowledge itself was important. You learned because those skills were required for specific professions: government administration, tax collection, trade negotiations, legal contracts, all of which were urban occupations dependent on a functioning economy. In rural areas, literacy had no practical use. In fact, it was worse than useless. It was a waste of time. Why spend years learning to read Latin when you could instead learn to farm, to forge metal, to build? The practical abilities that ensured survival. These essential skills did not require reading, so people stopped teaching it. Within 2 generations, the children of illiterate Romans became illiterate farmers, and their own children grew up with no memory that literacy had ever mattered. But it was not only literacy that disappeared. Technical knowledge of all kinds faded as well. The knowledge of how to construct stone bridges, how to produce concrete, how to measure land accurately, how to build multi-story structures, all of it was carefully recorded in Roman technical manuals. But if no one could read those manuals, the knowledge effectively ceased to exist. The archaeological evidence from this period is deeply haunting. We find Roman buildings abandoned, then gradually dismantled for their materials. We discover villa sites that abruptly show no signs of occupation around 450 or 500 CE. We uncover layers of what is called dark earth in former Roman towns, essentially accumulated debris and decay covering what remains of Roman structures. But this is where it becomes even more puzzling. The pattern of abandonment is not consistent. Some regions fall into disorder quickly, while others preserve a degree of organization for centuries. Britain, for instance, appears to undergo almost total collapse. By 500 CE, cities in Britain are abandoned. Pottery production, once a refined industry, reverts to crude, handmade vessels. Even basic stone construction seems to be forgotten, with people returning to building in wood as their pre-Roman ancestors once did. Yet, in other regions, such as Italy and parts of Gaul, there is continuity. Cities become smaller but do not vanish entirely. Literacy declines but does not disappear. Some level of trade persists. It is not a uniform darkness. It is uneven, fragmented, frustratingly difficult to fully comprehend. And then there are the mysteries, the aspects we still cannot explain. Consider the settlements. During the peak of what we call the Dark Ages, roughly 600 to 800 CE, archaeological evidence reveals thousands of small communities across Europe, villages, hamlets, isolated farms, yet there are almost no written records describing them. Who lived there? How were they organized? What did they believe? We can excavate their post holes and refuse pits, but we cannot hear their voices. Some settlements display signs of careful planning, with rectangular buildings arranged in rows, suggesting some form of central authority. Others appear almost random, with structures scattered without any clear pattern. Some show evidence of trade goods that traveled hundreds of miles, while others seem entirely isolated. It is like attempting to understand modern society by examining only the trash we leave behind. You might manage to learn a few things, but everything truly important slips past you. Then the Vikings arrived. Beginning around 793 CE, with the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery, seafarers from Scandinavia started expanding across Europe and far beyond, and this is where the frustration sets in. We know the Vikings achieved extraordinary success. They built trade routes stretching from Baghdad all the way to North America. They established cities that are still inhabited today. They engineered advanced ships capable of crossing vast oceans. But we still don't fully understand how they accomplished all of this. The Norse people did not begin recording their knowledge in writing until centuries later, after converting to Christianity, long after their expansion had already begun. Nearly everything we know about early Viking culture comes from archaeological findings and sagas written much later, texts that blend myth and history and are unreliable when it comes to exact details or timelines. How did Norse society coordinate expeditions with hundreds of warriors and dozens of vessels? How did they find their way across open seas without compasses? How did they sustain supply lines over thousands of miles? We have hypotheses, informed speculation, but the reality is that we simply do not know. The Vikings left behind their objects, but not their instructions. The only place where knowledge was consistently preserved was within monasteries. As the Roman world fell apart, the Christian Church became the last institution with both the means and the motivation to preserve literacy. Monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, recreating ancient texts by hand, one letter at a time. Everything we understand about classical literature survives because some medieval monk decided it was worth preserving. But here lies the tragedy. The monks made choices. They saved what they believed mattered, which meant religious writings and works by Christian thinkers were given priority. Pagan works, scientific studies, technical guides, and vast portions of ancient knowledge were neglected and allowed to decay. We are aware of hundreds of texts that existed in the early medieval period but have since vanished. We know they existed because they are mentioned in surviving documents. Yet the texts themselves are gone, and in some cases, the act of preservation itself caused destruction. Vellum, the specially treated animal skin used for writing, was costly, so monks would sometimes erase older texts, scraping them away to reuse the material for new writings. These reused pages are known as palimpsests, and with modern imaging techniques, we can sometimes recover the erased words beneath. What we have uncovered is devastating. Lost plays by Sophocles, scientific works by unknown Roman authors, historical records that could have filled critical gaps in our understanding. All of it erased to make room for copies of texts that already existed in multiple versions. The population decline during this era was immense. Although precise numbers are uncertain, some estimates suggest that Europe's population dropped by 50% or more between 400 and 600 CE. This decline was not driven mainly by war or invasion. It was caused by disease, famine, and the breakdown of trade networks that had once supported specialized urban life. When populations shrink, specialization disappears with them. In a city of 50,000, there is room for full-time scribes, architects, and engineers. In a village of 200, everyone must become a generalist. Everyone must know how to grow food, craft tools, and build shelter. The specialized knowledge that once defined Roman civilization became an unaffordable luxury. Recent discoveries have begun to fill in some of these gaps, although each answer seems to raise even more questions. Excavations across Europe have shown that the so-called Dark Ages were not as dark as we once believed. Evidence of advanced metalworking has been found continuing throughout the period. Trade networks have been uncovered that no one previously suspected existed. Burial sites have revealed grave goods originating from thousands of miles away, proving that long-distance connections never entirely disappeared. Yet these findings also emphasize how much has been lost. Every advanced artifact we uncover leads to a new question. If they could create this, what else were they capable of that has not survived? Every object from distant lands points to networks and relationships we still do not understand. Every well-built structure confirms the existence of architects and engineers whose identities are lost forever. The Dark Ages were not dark because nothing occurred. They are dark because we cannot clearly see what occurred. Somewhere between 400 and 1000 CE, Europe underwent a complete transformation. The world of city-states and empires gave way to feudal systems and monarchies. Classical culture faded, and medieval culture emerged. Some technologies disappeared, while others were invented. Languages changed, populations moved, entire groups of people appeared and vanished, and we witnessed almost none of it. We are like someone trying to follow a film where 90% of the frames are missing. We are able to observe how it begins and how it ends. Yet the transformation itself, that essential middle phase, has simply disappeared. We know that Rome collapsed, and we know that medieval Europe eventually took shape. But the actual transition between those two states, the real process of change, remains frustratingly obscure. That is the true enigma of the Dark Ages. It is not that civilization declined, because civilizations decline repeatedly throughout history. The real question is how completely the historical record vanished. How does a literate society become illiterate? How can technical knowledge simply fade away? How do entire centuries pass with almost no written documentation? The answer appears to be that civilization is far more delicate than we tend to believe, that the systems supporting literacy, knowledge, and record-keeping are neither natural nor guaranteed. They must be actively preserved. And when they are not, they collapse far more quickly than anyone expects. Within a generation or two, skills that required centuries to develop can disappear entirely in just a few years. Great cities can be abandoned and overtaken by wilderness. The Dark Ages serve as a warning written in absence. They show us that history is not inevitable, that progress is not permanent, that the elements we consider fundamental to civilization can vanish almost overnight if the structures that sustain them fail. They are dark not only because we cannot see into them, but because they reveal how quickly the lights can go out, how easily centuries of accumulated knowledge can be erased, how rapidly a complex society can forget nearly everything it once understood. And within those missing centuries, people lived, loved, struggled, and died. They had stories we will never hear, achievements we will never discover, innovations that disappeared with them. They are not dark because those people lacked knowledge. They are dark because we do. We are the ones who cannot see. We are the ones who lost the record. The real question is not whether the Dark Ages were truly dark. The real question is, what else have we lost without ever realizing it existed? Now consider a historical gap that is much closer to us. One that is especially frustrating because it occurred recently enough that we should have clear knowledge of it, yet vast portions remain completely unknown. The Americas before European contact. And what makes this gap so infuriating is that we are not trying to reconstruct events from 10,000 years ago. We are talking about flourishing civilizations that existed just 500, 600 years ago. Cities with populations numbering in the tens of thousands. Complex societies with extensive trade networks. And yet, for large portions of this history, we know almost nothing. Because when Europeans first arrived in the Americas, they encountered what appeared to be a largely empty continent. There were scattered indigenous groups, yes, but vast regions seemed nearly uninhabited. Early colonists saw this and assumed that the Americas had always been sparsely populated. This idea became the dominant narrative that the New World was a pristine wilderness, barely touched by human activity. But archaeology tells a completely different story. The evidence suggests that on the eve of European contact, the Americas were home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. That is not a small population. It is comparable to the population of Europe at the same time. These people lived in cities, constructed monumental architecture, developed complex agricultural systems, and built sophisticated social structures. Then, within a century of European arrival, perhaps 90% of them were gone, and their histories disappeared with them. Consider Cahokia. Most people have never heard of it. Yet, around the year 1050, it was the largest city in North America. Not just the largest indigenous city, but the largest city overall. Larger than London, larger than Paris. It was a vast urban center near present-day Street Louis, with an estimated population of 10,000 to 20,000 people, possibly even more. Archaeological evidence suggests that the broader urban area may have supported as many as 40,000 people at its peak. Think about that. 40,000 individuals living in a carefully planned city with distinct neighborhoods, massive earthen pyramids, and an advanced understanding of astronomy and engineering. The largest mound at Cahokia, Monk's Mound, spans 14 acres at its base and rises 100 feet high. It contains approximately 22 million cubic feet of earth, all transported by hand, one basket at a time. That is more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza, and it is just one of more than 120 mounds that once stood there. The city itself was aligned with remarkable precision to solar events. The people of Cahokia constructed a wood henge, a circular arrangement of massive cedar posts used to track solstices and equinoxes. They built an enormous central plaza larger than 35 football fields. They developed residential districts containing thousands of homes. They constructed an enormous wooden palisade surrounding the central settlement, a defensive wall that required 20,000 logs and would have demanded a highly organized workforce working together over several years to complete. This was not a modest village. It was a full-fledged civilization. What archaeologists refer to as the Mississippian culture dominated the Mississippi River Valley along with its tributaries for many centuries. They established hundreds of mound complexes across what is now the southeastern United States. They also created extensive long-distance trade networks that stretched from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic coast across to the Rocky Mountains. Shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from Lake Superior, obsidian from the Rockies, all of it moved through a commercial system that required advanced economic coordination and planning. Then, around 1350, Cahokia was abandoned. It was not destroyed through conquest, nor burned by invading forces. It was simply vacated. Within only a few decades, a city that had dominated the region for 3 centuries disappeared. Its population dispersed, its structures left behind to slowly deteriorate. By the time Europeans arrived in the area during the 1500s, Cahokia had already been deserted for more than 150 years. The native communities living nearby no longer had a clear memory of who had constructed these immense earthworks. The knowledge had vanished. To this day, we still do not know why Cahokia declined. There are many theories, but none fully satisfy the evidence. It may have been environmental damage. Supporting such a large population would have required intensive farming, which could have exhausted the soil. It may have been climate change, as there is evidence suggesting a regional drought around the time the city was abandoned. It could have been political breakdown, where the social systems that once held such a large population together collapsed. It might even have been disease, with a possible epidemic devastating a densely populated urban center. But the truth is, we simply do not know. The people who could have explained it were gone long before anyone thought to record their story. And Cahokia was not alone. The Mississippian culture built similar urban centers throughout the eastern half of North America: Etowah in Georgia, Moundville in Alabama, Spiro in Oklahoma, each home to thousands of inhabitants, monumental constructions, and complex social hierarchies. Most of these places were abandoned before Europeans ever arrived. The few that were still occupied at the time of European contact were rapidly destroyed by disease, conflict, and forced relocation. Their histories disappeared along with them. If you move further west, the same pattern emerges. The ancestral Puebloans, often referred to as the Anasazi, created some of the most remarkable architectural achievements in North America, entire cities carved into cliff faces, such as Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. These were not simple shelters. Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon contained over 600 rooms and rose 4 stories high. It remained the largest building in North America until the 1880s, when it was finally surpassed by an apartment building in New York. Chaco Canyon served as the center of a civilization that controlled the Four Corners region for centuries. The Chacoans constructed hundreds of miles of perfectly straight roads connecting distant settlements to the central canyon. Not mere paths, but roads up to 30 feet wide, deliberately engineered using advanced construction techniques. They aligned their buildings with solar and lunar cycles with a level of precision that required sophisticated astronomical understanding. They managed water in a harsh desert environment through a complex system of dams, reservoirs, and irrigation channels. And then, around 1150, they left. The great houses of Chaco Canyon were abandoned. The road network fell into disuse. A civilization that had flourished for 300 years simply walked away. We can trace fragments of where they may have gone. Modern Pueblo peoples are clearly their descendants, preserving elements of their culture, language, and traditions, but the detailed history of what happened, why they departed, and exactly where they migrated is largely lost. Another gap in the historical record. Archaeological evidence from across the Americas repeats this same pattern again and again. Clear signs of large populations, sophisticated societies, and complex cultural achievements, followed by sudden abandonment, disappearance, or collapse, often occurring shortly before or shortly after European contact. And what makes this especially tragic is the timing. Because European arrival did not only bring colonization and conquest, it also brought disease. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza illnesses to which Native American populations had no natural immunity. These epidemics spread faster than the Europeans themselves. Ships arriving along the coast introduced diseases that traveled inland through trade networks, devastating communities hundreds of miles away from any European presence. By the time colonists began moving deeper into the continent, they were often entering lands that had already been emptied by diseases that had arrived years, sometimes even decades earlier. The magnitude of this disaster is almost beyond our ability to fully grasp. Early Spanish explorers in the southeastern regions recorded accounts of densely inhabited landscapes, with settlements appearing every few miles. The Spanish chronicler Hernando de Soto, traveling through the southeast in 1540, described prosperous communities, rich agriculture, and large populations. Yet, when French explorers followed those same paths about 150 years later, they encountered a land that was nearly deserted. The settlements had vanished. The inhabitants had disappeared. What had taken place? Disease, spreading in relentless waves of epidemics through populations that had no immunity. Communities that had endured for centuries were erased within a single generation. And when the people perished, their knowledge vanished with them. Their history, carried through oral traditions across generations, died alongside the last storytellers. Their customs, their systems of organization, their understanding of their own past, all of it disappeared. We catch glimpses of what was lost through the limited written records that remain. When Europeans reached the upper Mississippi Valley in the late 1600s, they encountered vast earthwork complexes, mounds arranged in intricate geometric patterns, some stretching across hundreds of acres. The indigenous communities living nearby told the French they did not know who had constructed them. The knowledge had already faded, the societies responsible for these monuments having collapsed long before living memory. Modern archaeology has revealed just how extensive these losses are. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR scans, and satellite imaging have uncovered thousands of previously unknown archaeological sites across the Americas. In the Amazon, once believed to be untouched wilderness, LiDAR has uncovered evidence of enormous pre-Columbian settlements, earthworks, extending across thousands of square miles. Proof of advanced agricultural systems capable of sustaining large populations, entire cities hidden within the jungle that were abandoned and reclaimed by the forest long before Europeans ever arrived. In North America, surveys have shown that these earthwork complexes are far more expansive than once believed. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, constructed by the Hopewell culture around 100 CE, spans nearly 4 square miles. It features precise geometric designs, circles, squares, and octagons aligned with astronomical events. This achievement required not only immense labor, but also advanced mathematical and astronomical understanding. Yet, we have no written documentation explaining why they were built, what purpose they served, how labor was organized, or how these sites were maintained over centuries. Estimates of the population in pre-Columbian North America continue to increase as new archaeological discoveries emerge. Current figures suggest that between 5 to 10 million people may have lived north of Mexico before European contact, most of them within complex societies featuring social hierarchies, trade networks, and cultural accomplishments comparable to those found in Europe at the same time. And yet, we know almost nothing about the detailed histories of most of these societies who governed them, what beliefs they held, how their economies functioned, or what stories they told about their origins. The gap in our understanding is astonishing. We possess more detailed records of ancient Rome, which existed 2,000 years ago, than we do of Cahokia, which flourished just 600 years ago. We can trace the political complexities of medieval European kingdoms in remarkable detail, yet we struggle to reconstruct even the basic structure of Mississippian political systems. We have extensive written documentation from ancient China spanning thousands of years, but almost nothing written by the ancestral Puebloans about themselves. This absence of knowledge does not exist because these civilizations were simple or insignificant. It exists because they developed different methods of preserving information. Many relied on oral traditions rather than written records. And oral traditions, no matter how refined, are fragile. They depend on continuous transmission from one generation to the next. Break that chain through disease, conflict, or forced displacement, and the knowledge disappears forever. Modern indigenous communities still carry fragments of this past through oral traditions, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs that connect them to their ancestors. But even these connections are often incomplete, disrupted by centuries of colonization, forced migration, and cultural suppression. The descendants of these once great civilizations often know that their ancestors built the mounds, carved the cliffs, and shaped the earthworks. But the specific details, the reasons, the methods, much of that has been lost. What remains are monuments without context. Vast earthworks stretching across thousands of acres that we can measure and map but not fully understand. Advanced astronomical alignments, whose function we can only speculate about, trade routes, stretching across an entire continent, whose economic structure still remains unclear. Cities that accommodated tens of thousands of inhabitants, whose social organization we barely understand, and a demographic collapse so devastating that it wiped out the cultural memory of entire civilizations before that memory could ever be preserved in a lasting written form. The Americas before Columbus were not empty, lands waiting to be found. They were inhabited by millions of people living within complex societies, with their own histories, accomplishments, and narratives, and most of those narratives have disappeared, lost in the gap between the fall of pre-Columbian civilizations and the emergence of written documentation. Another void in human history. Another reminder that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is often evidence of loss. Consider something that should trouble you more than it likely does around 3,300 BCE. While Mesopotamia and Egypt were only beginning to develop urban life, a civilization arose in the Indus River Valley that in nearly every measurable aspect surpassed both of them: more advanced city planning, more refined sanitation systems, standardized systems of weights and measures, and clear evidence of long-distance trade networks extending from Mesopotamia to Central Asia. And then around 1300 BCE, it simply disappeared. Not gradually, not through a dramatic collapse. It just dissolved into historical silence. And here is the most unsettling part. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not understand how their political system functioned. We have no knowledge of the gods they worshipped or the stories they shared with their children. We cannot decipher their writing. We do not even know their language for a civilization that endured for 2,000 years and spanned an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. We know almost nothing about how they truly lived. Think about that for a moment. The Harappan civilization, as it is referred to by archaeologists, had an estimated population of 5 million people at its peak. 5 million more than the entire population of ancient Egypt during the Old Kingdom. They constructed over 400 settlements, including enormous cities such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, with populations reaching 40,000 or more. These were not simple villages. These were carefully designed urban centers, featuring grid-based layouts, advanced drainage systems, public baths, and multi-story structures. They were practicing urban planning on a level that would not be seen again in Europe until the time of the Roman Empire. And yet, when you walk through a museum and observe Egyptian artifacts, you can read the hieroglyphs, interpret their religious texts, learn the names of pharaohs and the stories of their gods. But when you encounter seals from the Indus Valley marked with their enigmatic symbols, you are met with silence. Intricate, elegant, and profoundly silent. The archaeological traces of Harappan sophistication are visible everywhere once you begin to look. Consider Mohenjo-Daro, likely the most well-preserved Harappan city. Its name means Mound of the Dead in Sindhi, which reveals nothing about what its original inhabitants called it. Everything we understand about them comes from what they left behind. And what they left behind is remarkable. The city was organized on a grid, with streets crossing at right angles, not the result of random organic growth as seen in many ancient cities, but of intentional design. Primary streets running north-south, secondary streets running east-west, forming consistent urban blocks. Buildings constructed from standardized fired bricks, all following the same precise proportions. This was not the vision of a single planner. This was a civilization-wide standard, maintained for centuries across hundreds of settlements. Someone had to define those standards. Someone had to ensure they were followed, but we have no idea who. There are no palaces, no temples, clearly identified as religious centers, no monuments honoring powerful rulers, no inscriptions celebrating great victories or divine authority. And then there is the drainage system. Every house in Mohenjo-Daro was connected to an advanced network of covered drains running along the streets, bathrooms equipped with toilets, wells, providing fresh water. The Great Bath, a large public bathing structure with waterproof construction and an intricate drainage design. This level of infrastructure implies centralized planning and ongoing maintenance. You do not build sanitation systems on a city-wide scale without administration, without systems of labor or taxation, without decision-making authorities determining where drains are placed and how they are maintained. Yet, there is no clear archaeological evidence of the administrative buildings. One would expect no massive temple complexes like those in Mesopotamia, no vast palace compounds like those in Egypt, only uniform housing, carefully organized streets, and this astonishing infrastructure that somehow functioned for 1,000 years without leaving obvious traces of the governing system that must have created it, the Indus script. This only deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. It becomes more troubling because we know they possessed a system of writing. We have discovered more than 4,000 inscribed objects, most of them small seals depicting animals, human forms, and sequences of symbols. The script appears on pottery, copper tablets, and the well-known steatite seals that likely functioned as markers of ownership or identity. The symbols themselves are strikingly elegant, made up of around 400 distinct signs, which suggests a logosyllabic system similar to Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform. But here is where the difficulty lies. The inscriptions are extremely brief. Most contain fewer than 5 symbols. The longest example known contains only 26 symbols. This makes deciphering them extraordinarily difficult. With texts this short, it becomes nearly impossible to detect reliable patterns. You cannot determine grammar or syntax. You cannot even confidently establish whether the text should be read from left to right, right to left, or in alternating directions. Scholars have spent more than a century attempting to decode the Indus script. Some believe it represents a genuine writing system tied to spoken language. Others argue it may simply be a set of symbolic markers, similar to modern corporate logos, conveying meaning without encoding speech. There is no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription that could serve as a key to interpretation. The civilization existed alongside Mesopotamia, and there is evidence of trade between them. Yet no Indus Valley text has ever been found written in cuneiform, and no cuneiform record clearly describes the Harappan people in enough detail to reveal their language. It is like discovering a vast library, where every book has lost its content, leaving only the title behind, and that title is written in a language no one alive can understand. You know knowledge once existed there. You know they had ideas, stories, and records to share. But the substance of it all remains sealed away unless we somehow manage to break the code. Recent technological progress has offered new possibilities, but it has also sparked debate. Computer scientists have examined the Indus script using statistical analysis, comparing it to known languages as well as random symbol systems. Some studies indicate that the arrangement of symbols follows patterns consistent with linguistic structure, suggesting it truly is a form of writing. Other researchers remain doubtful, pointing out that short sequences can easily produce misleading statistical results. Machine learning models have also been trained on the available inscriptions, attempting to uncover grammatical patterns or predict missing symbols in damaged texts. These methods have generated intriguing ideas, but no conclusive answers. The core issue still remains. Without longer texts or a bilingual reference, we are effectively trying to reconstruct an entire language from nothing more than fragments like business cards and shipping labels. And this gap in understanding extends far beyond the script itself, affecting everything we try to infer about Harappan society. We find standardized weights and measures, indicating regulated trade and commerce. Yet there is no clear evidence of marketplaces or merchant districts. We see finely crafted jewelry and artistic objects, suggesting skilled artisans and some degree of social differentiation. but we do not find obvious palaces or elite residences that would point to clear hierarchies. The uniformity of housing is particularly striking. Unlike Mesopotamian cities, where elite homes cluster near temples, or Egyptian settlements that clearly separate administrative residences from worker quarters, Harappan cities display a remarkable consistency in structure across the entire settlement. Some homes are larger than others, but there is nothing resembling the massive palace complexes one would expect in a civilization of such scale and sophistication. This has led to a range of theories about Harappan governance. Some scholars propose that it may have been a more egalitarian society, possibly governed by merchant councils rather than kings. Others suggest control by a priestly class whose authority was spiritual instead of military, which could explain the absence of obvious palaces alongside structures like the Great Bath that may have held ritual importance. A few even suggest the possibility that there was no centralized government at all, that standardization and infrastructure were maintained through shared cultural norms and traditions rather than top-down rule. However, all of these remain hypotheses informed by archaeological evidence but still speculative, attempts to fill the silence created by our inability to read their own descriptions of themselves. Their religious practices are just as uncertain. We discover figurines that might represent goddesses, or perhaps they are simply toys. We see seals depicting figures in yoga-like poses that could be deities, or they might be human figures. Certain animals appear repeatedly: bulls, elephants, tigers, which may hold religious meaning, or they might simply be common artistic subjects. There is a well-known seal showing a seated figure surrounded by animals that some scholars interpret as a proto-Shiva, suggesting a possible connection between Harappan religion and later Hindu tradition. Others argue that this interpretation projects later religious ideas onto evidence that does not clearly support such conclusions. In the absence of texts that explain religious beliefs, without clearly identifiable temples or unmistakable religious symbols, we are left to piece together spiritual life from artifacts that can be interpreted in multiple ways. And then there is the disappearance. Around 1900 BCE, the great urban centers began to decline, not abruptly, but slowly over many generations. The quality of construction deteriorated, and the once precise urban planning became less consistent. Some settlements were gradually abandoned. By 1300 BCE, the major cities were mostly deserted, and the civilization as a distinct cultural identity had effectively disappeared. Yet there is no clear evidence of conquest, no layers of ash indicating invasion, no mass graves suggesting widespread disease. The climate did shift, with changes in monsoon patterns and rivers altering their courses, which would have impacted farming and trade. But civilizations rarely fade quietly due to gradual environmental change. They evolve, relocate, adapt. The Harappans appear to have done all of these, dispersing into smaller communities, perhaps moving east toward the Ganges Valley. However, in doing so, they seem to have lost the centralized structure that once defined their unique culture. Then comes the gap, the period between the decline of the Harappan civilization and the rise of Vedic culture around 1500 BCE remains unclear and difficult to interpret. The Vedic people spoke an Indo-European language, Sanskrit, entirely unrelated to whatever language the Harappans used. The Vedic texts, composed over centuries and later written down, contain no obvious memory of the great cities of the Indus Valley. There are no stories of abandoned urban centers, no myths explaining mysterious ruins. It is as though the Harappan civilization had been completely forgotten within just a few centuries after its decline. Some scholars argue for continuity, suggesting that elements of Harappan religion and culture were absorbed into Vedic traditions. Others believe there was a complete break, a replacement of one culture by another. But without written records from the Harappans themselves, and without clear archaeological evidence showing how the transition occurred, we are left with competing interpretations and limited data. Why do we know so little, despite the abundance of physical remains? Part of the explanation lies in preservation. The Indus Valley has been continuously inhabited for 5,000 years. Modern cities have been built on top of ancient ones. Agricultural activity has disturbed countless archaeological sites. The region's climate is not favorable for preserving organic materials such as wood, cloth, or paper that might have contained longer texts. Yet, other civilizations have faced similar challenges and still managed to leave behind records we can read. The real issue is the script. Without the ability to decipher their writing, we cannot access their own explanations of who they were. We are forced to rely solely on physical evidence, and physical evidence alone cannot reveal what people believed, how they organized their societies, what stories they told, or what they considered meaningful. This leaves us with a strange paradox. A civilization advanced enough to sustain urban infrastructure for 1,000 years, to standardize measurements and construction across a vast region, to engage in long-distance trade, and to produce intricate works of art, yet one that remains fundamentally beyond our understanding. They had context, deep and meaningful context behind everything they did, but that context has been lost. All that remains are the artifacts, silent yet striking, showing that something extraordinary occurred, while offering no explanation of what it meant to those who created them. Somewhere within those undeciphered symbols lie answers, names, narratives, and explanations. The Harappans knew exactly who they were. They simply never imagined a future in which no one else would. And here is something that should make you uneasy. When we talk about ancient history, we often speak with certainty about Roman emperors, Chinese dynasties, Persian kings. We can describe what they ate, how they dressed, whom they married. We have their writings, their laws, their poetry, but ask about the kingdoms of medieval West Africa, the empires that controlled the gold trade and stirred envy among European rulers, and suddenly the narrative becomes unclear. Ask about the people who built Great Zimbabwe, one of the most impressive stone complexes in the ancient world, and we hesitate. Ask about the Nok culture, who were producing iron in West Africa while Europe was still developing bronze working, and we admit that we know very little about them. This is not because Africa lacked advanced civilizations. It is because their histories were lost, or more precisely, neglected, dismissed, and allowed to fade from record. Over time, vast portions of African history became gaps, unanswered questions, entire centuries waiting to be rediscovered. The issue begins with how history is preserved. In Europe and Asia, written documentation stretches back thousands of years. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia recording grain transactions as early as 3000 BCE. Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions describing the reigns of pharaohs, Chinese historical records documenting everything from celestial phenomena to the gossip of royal courts. These societies created writing systems very early on and relied on them extensively, producing multiple copies of significant texts and engraving information into stone designed to endure for thousands of years. However, many civilizations across Africa followed a different path. Instead of written archives, they safeguarded their histories through oral traditions, complex methods of storytelling, poetry, and music, preserved and transmitted by highly trained historians known as griots. These were not simple stories shared casually around a fire. They were carefully memorized narratives, sometimes lasting for hours, detailing lineages, key events, and cultural customs. In cultures with strong oral traditions, griots could recite the names and achievements of rulers across dozens of generations with remarkable precision, without overlooking a single detail. The difficulty is that oral traditions do not survive societal collapse in the same way that stone inscriptions do. When a civilization is destroyed by conflict, disease, or environmental disaster, its libraries may be reduced to ashes, but archaeologists can still uncover ruins, recover tablets, and piece together written histories. But if griots pass away before transmitting their knowledge, if the chain of cultural continuity is broken, then the history disappears entirely. There are no ruins to excavate, no artifacts to interpret, only silence where stories once existed. This is precisely what occurred across much of sub-Saharan Africa, not because these societies lacked sophistication, but because the catastrophes they endured were so devastating that the transmission of oral knowledge was completely interrupted. And when European colonizers eventually arrived, their interest was not in preserving what remained. Instead, they promoted the idea that the continent had no meaningful history to preserve at all. Consider Great Zimbabwe. In the hills of southeastern Africa stands one of the most extraordinary architectural accomplishments of the medieval era. Towering stone walls, some reaching 36 feet in height, constructed without mortar from carefully fitted granite blocks. A vast complex of enclosures extending across nearly 1,800 acres, featuring a conical tower, intricate corridors, and advanced drainage systems. At its height, around 1300 CE, this city served as the capital of a powerful kingdom that controlled the gold trade between the African interior and the Swahili merchants along the coast. It may have been home to approximately 18,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest urban centers in medieval Africa. When Europeans first encountered these ruins in the late 19th century, they refused to accept that Africans had built them. They insisted there must be another explanation. They claimed the structures were Phoenician, constructed by the miners of King Solomon, or built by lost Arab traders. Anything except acknowledging the obvious truth that indigenous African peoples had developed a highly sophisticated stone-building civilization. This was not merely prejudice, although it certainly was that. It was also an act of erasure. By denying local peoples the credit for Great Zimbabwe, colonizers justified dismissing and suppressing the oral traditions that might have revealed who the builders were, how their society operated, and why they eventually abandoned such an impressive city. Instead of documenting and preserving these accounts, colonial authorities actively worked to silence them. As a result, even today, more than a century after archaeologists conclusively demonstrated that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Africans, we still lack essential knowledge about the civilization behind it. We do not know what the builders called their city. We do not know the official titles of their rulers or the structure of their political system. We possess only fragments of their trade networks and partial clues about their spiritual practices. There remain unanswered questions about why such a powerful kingdom left behind no written records and ultimately declined into obscurity. The kingdom of Kush presents a similar narrative, but with an added layer of tragic irony. For over 1,000 years, from around 1070 BCE to 350 CE, the Kushite civilization flourished along the Nile in what is now Sudan. At various times, they even conquered Egypt itself. The Kushite rulers of the 25th dynasty governed one of the most formidable empires of the ancient world. They constructed pyramids, not simple imitations of Egyptian forms, but their own distinctive versions, steeper and more numerous. They also developed a unique writing system known as the Meroitic script, which appears on temples, tombs, and everyday objects. And here lies the tragedy. We are unable to read it. Despite decades of work by linguists and archaeologists, the Meroitic script remains largely undeciphered. We know it is not directly related to Egyptian hieroglyphs, even though it borrowed certain symbols. We can recognize names and a handful of words, but the majority of the texts remain inaccessible, locked away, because when the Kushite kingdom fell, it seems that no one survived who could pass on the meaning of the script to future generations. Just consider what has been lost. Picture a world where we were unable to read ancient Greek or Latin. Imagine that the entirety of Roman history was an enigma, and all of Greek philosophy had vanished simply because no one retained the knowledge to interpret the symbols. That is the reality we face with Kush. We possess their monuments, their artifacts, and the remains of their cities. We understand that they were advanced, influential, and culturally vibrant, yet their own voices, their written accounts of their past, remain silent, leaving a void that we may never fully bridge. The Nok culture presents an even more puzzling case. Beginning around 1500 BCE in the Jos Plateau of what is now Nigeria, people started producing distinctive terracotta sculptures, intricate human figures with stylized features, carefully detailed hairstyles, and elaborate jewelry. These were not simple or primitive objects. They were refined works of art, demonstrating technical expertise and a consistent artistic tradition. Even more striking, the Nok were smelting iron by 1000 BCE, placing them among the earliest iron-working societies known. They appear to have bypassed the Bronze Age altogether, moving straight from stone tools to iron technology. This raises profound questions. Did they independently develop this innovation, which would be extraordinary, or did they have contact with other ironworking cultures, which would force us to rethink ancient trade connections? The truth is, we do not know. We do not know who the Nok people were, what name they used for themselves, or how their society was structured. We do not know whether they had a system of writing, since none has survived. Their language, their myths, and their political systems remain unknown. All that endures are their remarkable sculptures, scattered across a region later transformed by migrations, the rise of new states, and eventually colonial conquest. Whatever oral traditions once preserved Nok history were swept away in the upheavals of the following millennia. This pattern appears repeatedly across the continent. Medieval West African empires such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai controlled trade networks stretching across thousands of miles and accumulated immense wealth, becoming legendary even in faraway Europe. The ruler of the Mali Empire, Mansa Musa, famously disrupted the gold market in Cairo during his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, spending so lavishly that gold prices took years to recover. We know this occurred because it was recorded by Arab scholars. We have accounts from outside observers describing the wealth and influence of these kingdoms. Yet, internal records, the everyday workings of these empires, the perspectives of their own historians remain frustratingly incomplete. We know the names of certain rulers and the outlines of some conflicts and successions, but vast stretches of time remain unclear, understood only through archaeological interpretation and scattered foreign descriptions. Some of this absence is due to the natural loss of history over time, but some of it was deliberate. When colonial powers divided Africa in the late 19th century, their goal was not to preserve indigenous histories. Instead, they promoted the idea that Africa had no meaningful past, no civilizations worthy of recognition, no achievements that might challenge the narrative of European superiority. Libraries were destroyed not by accident but intentionally. Oral historians were dismissed as unreliable, and their carefully maintained traditions were reduced to so-called primitive myths. Archaeological sites were looted, their objects taken to European museums without concern for context or the preservation of knowledge. Perhaps most damaging of all, African children were taught that their ancestors had no history, that civilization began only with European arrival, and that anything impressive on the continent must have originated from elsewhere. The effects of this erasure are still evident today. Entire centuries of African history remain obscure, understood only through fragments and educated guesses based on archaeology. We know that complex societies existed. We can see their artifacts, their structures, and their influence on neighboring regions. But their own narratives, their accounts of who they were and what they accomplished, are often missing. And yet, this is where the story begins to take a more hopeful turn. Unlike some historical gaps where evidence has been permanently lost, much of African history is not gone. It has simply been overlooked, dismissed, and left waiting to be properly studied and preserved. In recent decades, there has been a surge of archaeological research across sub-Saharan Africa, uncovering complex societies that earlier colonial-era scholarship claimed did not exist. In southern Africa, excavations have revealed extensive trade networks dating back more than 1,000 years, with goods from distant places like China and India appearing in local settlements. In West Africa, ancient cities, such as Geno, are reshaping our understanding of urban development, showing sophisticated planning long before contact with Islamic or European civilizations. Along the East African coast, researchers are documenting Swahili cities that served as intermediaries between the African interior and the Indian Ocean trade world, creating a unique and refined culture that was neither entirely African nor entirely Arab, but something distinct in its own right. At the same time, linguists are working with surviving oral traditions, carefully recording and analyzing the historical knowledge they contain and comparing it with archaeological findings to construct a fuller picture of the past. Perhaps most importantly, there is an increasing awareness that the lack of written documentation does not imply a lack of history. Oral traditions, when examined carefully and placed within proper context, are capable of preserving astonishing amounts of accurate knowledge across many generations. Archaeological findings, ranging from settlement patterns to artifacts to environmental data, allow researchers to reconstruct social systems even in the absence of written sources. The so-called lost centuries of African history are not necessarily gone forever. They are simply more difficult to reach, demanding greater care, deeper respect for alternative forms of historical preservation, and a stronger willingness to question long-held assumptions about what qualifies as valid historical evidence. With each passing year, new discoveries emerge. Ancient cities appearing beneath dense jungle growth, genetic research uncovering unexpected patterns of migration, linguistic studies revealing cultural links that had never been suspected. These gaps are gradually being filled, not through guesswork, but through evidence, rigorous scholarship, and, most importantly, African voices reclaiming and telling their own histories. The narrative of Africa's lost centuries is, in the end, a story about whose histories are preserved and whose are ignored, whose voices are valued and whose are dismissed. For far too long, those answers were shaped by colonial dominance and deeply rooted racist assumptions. But that is beginning to change. The silences are being broken, the missing pieces are being restored, and what is emerging is a far richer and more complex picture of human history than the simplified narratives handed down from an earlier and more biased era. Now let's turn to the largest ocean on Earth and one of the most extraordinary human achievements in history, an accomplishment that, for reasons still unclear, we barely understand. The Pacific Ocean spans nearly 64 million square miles, covering roughly 1/3 of the planet's entire surface. Scattered across this immense expanse are thousands of islands. Some are large landmasses, such as New Zealand and Hawaii. Others are tiny fragments of coral and volcanic rock, so small they are barely visible from more than a few miles away. And here is the astonishing part. By around 1200 CE, nearly every habitable island within this vast ocean had already been discovered, settled, and inhabited by people traveling in wooden canoes. No compasses, no sextants, no GPS, only outrigger canoes, deep knowledge of stars and ocean currents, and an almost unimaginable level of courage. This was the Polynesian expansion, one of the greatest feats of exploration and navigation in human history. And yet we still understand very little about how it was truly accomplished. Consider the scale of what we are describing. These were not short journeys along coastlines. Polynesian navigators traveled thousands of miles across open ocean, locating islands that were sometimes less than 10 miles wide, surrounded on all sides by hundreds or even thousands of miles of empty sea. The distance from Tahiti to Hawaii is approximately 2,600 miles. The journey from Tahiti to New Zealand exceeds 2,400 miles, and Easter Island, the most isolated inhabited island on Earth, lies 1,200 miles from the nearest landmass. Yet all of these distant places were not only found, but also settled and linked through regular voyaging routes. How was this possible? We do have some understanding. Polynesian navigators employed highly advanced methods known as wayfinding. They memorized the positions of hundreds of stars, knowing precisely where each star would rise and set along the horizon depending on latitude. They interpreted wave patterns, recognizing how ocean swells bent and reflected around islands that were still hidden beyond the horizon. They observed birds, aware that certain species only travel within specific distances from land. They studied clouds, understanding how atmospheric patterns shift in the presence of nearby islands. They even tracked the movement of bioluminescent organisms in the water, which could signal the existence of channels and currents. But here lies the difficulty. By the time European explorers reached the Pacific during the 1500s and 1600s, much of this knowledge had already begun to disappear. The great era of Polynesian exploration had ended centuries earlier. The vast network of voyaging routes that once connected islands across thousands of miles had largely fallen into disuse. The final major phase of expansion, the settlement of New Zealand by the Maori around 1300 CE, had taken place roughly 200 years before Europeans arrived. During those intervening centuries, much of the detailed navigational knowledge gradually faded from living memory. What we understand today about traditional Polynesian navigation comes primarily from a small number of islands in Micronesia, where these traditions survived into the 20th century. Researchers in the 1960s and 70s worked closely with master navigators from regions such as the Caroline Islands, documenting their knowledge and attempting to reconstruct the nearly lost art of wayfinding. These undertakings resulted in the creation of modern versions of traditional voyaging canoes, along with successful experimental journeys spanning thousands of miles across open ocean. But here is the important point. We still cannot be certain whether the knowledge preserved in Micronesia is truly identical to what was practiced during the Great Polynesian Expansion 1,000 years earlier. We have no clear measure of how complete our current understanding really is. We do not know how much knowledge has been lost over time, and that uncertainty applies only to navigation. The unknowns grow even more profound when we examine particular islands and the events that unfolded there. Consider Easter Island, known as Rapa Nui. This location has taken on an almost legendary status in popular imagination. The enormous stone heads, the moai, gaze inward across the island. The commonly told narrative goes something like this. Polynesian voyagers arrived around 1200 CE, discovering an untouched island blanketed in palm forests. For several centuries, they thrived, constructing those iconic statues, but eventually they cut down all the trees, devastated their environment, and their society collapsed into conflict and cannibalism by the time Europeans arrived in 1722. It is often presented as a warning story about environmental destruction, a civilization that brought about its own downfall through ecological mismanagement. However, more recent research indicates that this narrative is, at best, incomplete and, at worst, entirely inaccurate. First, the timeline of settlement continues to be pushed further back. Earlier estimates placed it at 1200 CE, then 800 CE. Now, some scholars suggest it may date as far back as 400 CE. This would imply that Rapa Nui civilization endured for more than 1,000 years before European contact, not merely a few centuries. Second, the idea of environmental collapse is being re-examined. Yes, the palm forests disappeared, but new evidence indicates that this may have been partly caused by rats that arrived with the Polynesian settlers, not solely by human deforestation. These rats consumed the palm seeds, preventing regrowth. Without the palms, the ecosystem changed, but it may not have fully collapsed. Third, the narrative of warfare and cannibalism is derived almost entirely from European accounts written after European diseases had already severely reduced the island's population. In other words, we are observing a society already in decline due to introduced illnesses, and then reconstructing its earlier history based on those distorted conditions. So, what was Rapa Nui society actually like at its peak? The truth is, we do not really know. We know they carved and transported hundreds of massive stone statues, some weighing more than 80 tons. We know they developed a unique system of writing known as Rongorongo, one of only a small number of independently created writing systems in human history. We know they constructed sophisticated stone platforms called ahu and produced intricate rock art. But we do not understand what their social organization looked like, how their economy operated, or why they stopped building statues sometime in the 1600s. The specifics of their rise, their period of prosperity, and their transformation before European arrival remain largely unknown. And Easter Island is not an isolated case. Consider Nan Madol. If you have never heard of it, that is understandable, as most people have not. It is located on the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia and stands as one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the Pacific, perhaps even in the world. Nan Madol is often referred to as the Venice of the Pacific. It consists of a network of artificial islands constructed on a coral reef lagoon. There are 92 man-made islands built from massive basalt columns and coral fill, all interconnected by a system of canals. The entire complex spans more than 200 acres. Some of the basalt columns used in its construction weigh up to 50 tons, and all of this was achieved without metal tools, without wheels, and without draft animals on a remote island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. When was it constructed? Current estimates suggest that building began around 1200 CE and continued until approximately 1500 CE. Who constructed it? The Sodler dynasty, apparently a ruling lineage that controlled Pohnpei and nearby islands. Why was it built? No one truly knows. The traditional explanation is that it served as a ceremonial and administrative center, but the immense scale of construction hints at something more complex. Some of the artificial islands appear to have been residential, while others seem to have functioned as ritual sites. One island contains structures that resemble tombs. The entire complex is aligned according to astronomical patterns that we still do not fully understand. And here is what makes it even more puzzling. When European explorers first came across Nan Madol in the 1820s, it had already been abandoned. The local Pohnpeians told them that the city had been deserted for generations, that no one lived there anymore. The Sodler dynasty had fallen centuries earlier, overthrown by a legendary warrior named Epoch. But the specifics of what actually took place, the reasons the city was left behind, what everyday life looked like when it was flourishing, all of that had already faded from living memory. Modern archaeological work at Nan Madol has been limited. It is isolated, difficult to reach, and the site itself is steadily deteriorating. Rising sea levels are putting the remaining structures at risk. Yet, even in its ruined condition, Nan Madol forces us to confront deep questions. How did a relatively small island community organize the workforce needed to construct something so immense? Where did the engineering expertise originate, and what circumstances led them to abandon it? These kinds of enigmas appear again and again across the Pacific. In Fiji, there are enormous hill forts that point to periods of intense warfare about which we know almost nothing. In Tonga, there are massive stone structures known as langi, used as royal tombs, yet the dynasties responsible for building them remain largely unknown to us. In Samoa, there are star mounds, whose purpose is still debated. And then there is the mystery that truly challenges our understanding of Pacific history: the sweet potato. The sweet potato is a plant from South America. It originated in the Andes, but when Europeans arrived in Polynesia, they discovered sweet potatoes already being cultivated across the Pacific, from Hawaii to New Zealand. The Polynesian word for sweet potato, kumara, is strikingly similar to words used for the plant in several South American languages. This suggests that, somehow, there was contact between Polynesia and South America before Europeans ever arrived. Polynesians either reached South America, or South Americans reached Polynesia, or perhaps both occurred. Recent DNA evidence has confirmed that such contact did happen. Studies of modern Polynesian populations reveal small amounts of Native American ancestry dating to around 1200 CE. So interaction clearly took place. Yet we have no written record describing it, no archaeological proof of South American settlements in Polynesia or Polynesian settlements in South America. All we have are the sweet potato, linguistic similarities, and genetic traces. Did Polynesian navigators reach South America, spend time there, and return with sweet potatoes, and perhaps even a few South American companions? Did South American sailors, possibly from the advanced maritime cultures along the coast of Peru, travel westward and arrive at Polynesian islands? We simply do not know. Both possibilities seem almost impossibly difficult, and yet one or both must have occurred. This is what makes the history of the Pacific so frustrating. We know that extraordinary events took place. We can see the evidence with our own eyes, but the details are missing. The human stories behind those events are lost, and much of what has disappeared will likely never be recovered. Unlike regions such as Egypt or Mesopotamia, where dry climates helped preserve written records, the humid tropical conditions of most Pacific islands rapidly destroy organic materials. There are no ancient Polynesian texts waiting to be rediscovered, no hidden libraries. What existed instead was oral tradition stories, genealogies, and navigational knowledge passed down through generations. Some of this knowledge survived into modern times and has been recorded, but a great deal of it vanished during the catastrophic population declines that followed European contact. Diseases such as measles, smallpox, and influenza devastated Pacific Island communities. On some islands, as much as 90% or more of the population died within a single generation after Europeans arrived. When losses happen on that scale, and so quickly, knowledge disappears as well. The elders who held the old stories are gone. The navigators who understood traditional routes are gone. The priests who preserved spiritual traditions are gone. Entire centuries of accumulated knowledge can vanish in the span of a single generation. Recent genetic research is revealing just how much we may have overlooked. DNA analysis of present-day Pacific populations shows migration patterns that do not align with earlier theories. It appears there were multiple waves of settlement, not just one. Some island groups show genetic contributions from populations we did not even realize had reached the Pacific. There are traces in the DNA suggesting connections we never suspected, journeys we never imagined. Linguistic research is uncovering similar layers of complexity. The languages of the Pacific form some of the most diverse language families in the world, and the relationships between them tell stories of movement, exchange, and isolation that we are only beginning to understand. Every few years, a new study reveals an unexpected link or challenges something we once thought certain. Taken together, all of this research paints a picture of the Pacific as a region defined by constant movement, innovation, and cultural interaction. Not a scattering of isolated islands, but an immense network of maritime pathways connecting thousands of communities across the largest ocean on Earth. A network that functioned for over 1,000 years before European contact disrupted it permanently. Yet the finer details, the individual accounts of exploration and settlement, of rise and collapse, of creativity and adaptation, most of that has been lost. We are left examining ruins and artifacts, studying genetic markers and linguistic remnants, attempting to piece together a past that had already begun to slip into legend by the time the first Europeans arrived. The Pacific's long-forgotten navigators achieved something that stands alongside the greatest accomplishments in human history. They explored and settled the largest ocean on Earth, using tools and vessels that may appear simple by modern standards, yet in their time represented the height of maritime innovation. They mastered navigation methods advanced enough to travel thousands of miles across open water and consistently find islands smaller than Manhattan. They built diverse, intricate societies in some of the most isolated and demanding environments on the planet, and yet we know so little about their story. That is the gap. That is what has been lost. Imagine yourself standing before the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is 2550 BCE. You watch thousands of laborers moving enormous limestone blocks with a level of precision that seems impossible for that era. Engineers are calculating angles with remarkable accuracy. Scribes are documenting everything in refined hieroglyphic script. The entire enterprise operates like a perfectly coordinated system, spread across multiple construction sites, supported by an advanced agricultural network and governed by a complex bureaucracy stretching along the Nile. Now, consider the detail that should give you pause. This pyramid, this extraordinary feat of human engineering, is not the starting point of Egyptian civilization. It is not even close. By the time the Great Pyramid was constructed, Egypt had already existed as a unified kingdom for more than 400 years. The Egyptians who built it were themselves looking back at an earlier past, studying monuments created by their ancestors, reading texts that were already ancient to them. But when you try to trace Egyptian civilization further back, before the pyramids, before political unification, you encounter something unusual. A gap, not a total absence of evidence, but something perhaps even more perplexing, a transformation so rapid it seems to defy everything we understand about how civilizations develop. Around 3100 BCE, Egypt appears on the historical stage as a fully developed and complex society. Hieroglyphic writing emerges, monumental architecture begins, a sophisticated religious system takes shape, centralized authority forms under the first pharaohs. All of this seems to happen in what is, historically speaking, an instant. Before that, there are scattered farming villages, simple pottery, basic tools, the kind of Neolithic culture found in many regions of the ancient world. Nothing that clearly leads to pyramids or hieroglyphs. It is like watching someone leap from basic arithmetic to advanced calculus in a single term. The progression does not make sense. Something is missing. Archaeologists refer to the time before dynastic Egypt as the pre-dynastic era, dividing it into orderly phases with names such as Nakada, I, Tu, and I. But these categories conceal more than they clarify, because what we are really observing is one of the most puzzling transformations in human history, compressed into only a few centuries. Let us begin with what is certain. Around 5500 BCE, people began settling along the Nile in permanent communities. They cultivated wheat and barley, raised cattle and goats, and produced simple pottery decorated with geometric designs. These were stable and successful societies, but nothing about them suggests a future superpower. They were simply Neolithic farmers, living much like others across the ancient world. By 3100 BCE, an individual named Nama, also known as Menes, unifies Upper and Lower Egypt into a single state. He wears the double crown and holds authority over millions of people. His scribes record his actions in fully developed hieroglyphic writing. His architects construct massive mud brick structures that require the coordination of thousands of workers. His priests conduct elaborate rituals within temples dedicated to a complex pantheon of deities. Yes, there are 2,400 years of development between these points, but most of the dramatic transformation occurs in just the final 400 years between roughly 3,500 and 3,100 BCE. Even then, the archaeological record presents these changes as sudden leaps rather than gradual evolution. Hieroglyphic writing illustrates this perfectly. The earliest writing systems we know, such as Sumerian cuneiform, can be traced developing over long periods. Simple pictographs gradually become more abstract, and accounting marks evolve into phonetic symbols. You can literally observe the invention of writing step by step. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing does not function in that way. The earliest samples we possess are already highly developed. They incorporate phonetic signs, ideograms, and determinatives in intricate combinations. This is not a case of primitive writing gradually figuring itself out. It is a refined system that seems to emerge almost fully developed around 3,200 BCE. Some scholars suggest that this implies the Egyptians must have been experimenting with writing earlier, even though we have yet to uncover any physical proof. Others propose that the Egyptians may have borrowed the concept of writing from Mesopotamia, where it appeared slightly earlier, and then quickly created their own entirely distinct system. Yet both explanations raise difficult questions. If writing had been evolving earlier, where are the awkward early attempts? Why do we not find practice inscriptions, experimental markings, or the inevitable errors that usually accompany the invention of something new? And if the idea was adopted from Mesopotamia, why is Egyptian writing so completely different in its structure and visual form? Why do we not see clearer similarities in its earlier stages? The architecture presents a similar puzzle. The first pyramid, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, was constructed around 2650 BCE for the pharaoh Djoser. It is not a crude or tentative first effort. It is an advanced structure that demonstrates a deep understanding of engineering, mathematics, and stone craftsmanship. The architect, Imhotep, did far more than simply pile stones together. He designed an entire complex with multiple tiers, underground chambers, and intricate decorative features. But here is the strange part. The Step Pyramid appears less than 500 years after the unification of Egypt. Before that time, Egyptian construction relied mainly on mud brick. The leap from mud brick structures to enormous stone pyramids is massive, not only in size, but in the entire body of knowledge required. You need the ability to quarry large stone blocks, to transport those blocks, some weighing several tons across long distances, to cut and fit them with precision, to design structures capable of supporting their own immense weight, to coordinate and sustain a large workforce, and to maintain consistency and quality over years or even decades of construction. That is an enormous amount of knowledge to develop within just a few centuries, and yet the archaeological record for the intermediate stages remains surprisingly limited. Some researchers have suggested that there may have been an earlier advanced culture, often referred to as Dynasty Zero or the Proto-Dynastic period, which laid the foundation for everything that followed. Evidence for this comes from a small number of mysterious figures that appear in fragments of king lists and on scattered artifacts. The most well-known among them is the Scorpion King, identified from a ceremonial mace head discovered at Hierakonpolis. The mace head depicts a ruler wearing what appears to be an early version of the white crown of Upper Egypt, engaged in some form of ritual activity. He is marked with a scorpion symbol, but his actual name remains unknown. We do not know exactly when he ruled or what he achieved. Was he a real monarch who contributed to the unification of Egypt before Narmer? Was he a local leader whose significance was later exaggerated? Or was he entirely mythical, a figure that never truly existed? We simply do not know. The evidence is too fragmentary. Yet, even the possibility of his existence hints that Egyptian kingship may have developed more gradually than the sudden appearance of Narmer would suggest. Perhaps unification was not a single dramatic event, but rather the result of generations of political consolidation that are only faintly visible in the archaeological record. Then there is Nabta Playa, and this is where the story becomes especially intriguing. Nabta Playa is a dried lake bed located in the Nubian desert, about 500 miles south of Cairo. Today, it is an extremely harsh and inhospitable environment, one of the driest places on Earth. However, between roughly 7,000 and 3,000 BCE, when the Sahara was greener and received more rainfall, Nabta Playa functioned as an oasis where lakes formed during seasonal monsoon rains. People gathered there, and they created something remarkable. Around 5000 BCE, possibly even earlier, large stone slabs were arranged in a circular formation at Nabta Playa. These were not placed randomly, nor were they simple markers. The stones appear to be aligned with astronomical events. Some researchers argue that they track the summer solstice, while others propose that they reflect more complex astronomical relationships. The structure includes stone alignments that may have functioned as a primitive calendar, helping people anticipate the arrival of monsoon rains. There are also buried stones arranged in patterns that some researchers believe could represent constellations. The entire site suggests a level of astronomical understanding and organizational capability that seems unexpected among small groups of Neolithic herders. Interpretations of Nabta Playa remain debated. Some archaeologists argue that the supposed astronomical alignments are exaggerated, suggesting that people may be identifying patterns that are not truly present. Others contend that the site provides evidence that the inhabitants of the Sahara were developing advanced systems of knowledge thousands of years before dynastic Egypt emerged. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, Nabta Playa reveals something important. The people who lived in what is now the Sahara Desert, before it became fully arid, were not simply wandering nomads waiting for civilization to arise. They were observing the sky, tracking celestial cycles, organizing collective labor for large construction efforts, and forming cosmological ideas sophisticated enough to be expressed in stone. And here lies the crucial connection. Around 3,500 BCE, as the Sahara experienced its final phase of drying and transformed from a green savanna into a vast desert, the people living there were forced to move. The environment was shifting rapidly. Seasonal rains began to fail. Lakes shrank and disappeared. Grasslands slowly gave way to endless sand. They faced only two options: perish or relocate. And the closest region offering dependable water was the Nile Valley. So what if the apparent sudden sophistication of late pre-dynastic Egypt was not truly sudden at all? What if it reflects the arrival of populations who had already been developing complex societies elsewhere, in regions that are now so dry and inhospitable that archaeology has barely touched them? What if the expertise that eventually constructed the pyramids, the knowledge that produced hieroglyphic writing, the astronomical precision that aligned temples and monuments, what if all of this had already been cultivated in the once green Sahara by communities whose settlements now lie buried beneath vast layers of sand? The climatic evidence supports such a possibility. The final drying of the Sahara occurred in stages between about 5000 and 3000 BCE, with the most extreme phase taking place just before the rise of dynastic Egypt, exactly when large-scale migration into the Nile Valley would be expected. The genetic evidence is less definitive, yet still intriguing. Analyses of both ancient and modern Egyptian DNA reveal influences from across North and East Africa, suggesting multiple waves of migration converging along the Nile. The builders of dynastic Egypt were not a single uniform population, but rather a blend of groups with diverse origins. And the cultural evidence adds another layer. The religious traditions of ancient Egypt include elements that seem to point toward a homeland located to the south and west, the direction of the now desert Sahara. Some of the earliest Egyptian myths describe a primordial mound rising out of chaotic waters, imagery that resembles land appearing as islands in seasonal lakes during periods of drought. But here is what makes this idea both compelling and deeply frustrating. If there truly was an advanced Saharan culture that migrated into Egypt and helped ignite civilization there, we may never uncover direct proof. The Sahara is immense and one of the harshest environments on Earth. Conducting archaeological surveys there is extremely difficult. Any settlements that once existed are likely buried under centuries of shifting sand, scattered by relentless winds and eroded by extreme temperature fluctuations that have reshaped the landscape for 5,000 years. We may be confronting one of those gaps in history that can never be fully resolved. A missing chapter we know must exist because the narrative feels incomplete without it, yet one that remains just beyond our reach. What we can say with certainty is this: Egyptian civilization did not emerge out of nothing. That is not how human societies evolve. People do not suddenly invent writing, monumental architecture, and complex governance without prior development. These achievements require time to form, which means there must have been a period of gradual growth somewhere. We can observe part of that development in the archaeological record of pre-dynastic Egypt, but it does not tell the whole story. There are too many discontinuities, too many abrupt leaps, too many advanced skills appearing without the gradual learning process we would expect. Something else took place. Perhaps several things. Perhaps migrations we can no longer trace. Perhaps exchanges of knowledge with other early civilizations. Perhaps traditions that developed in regions now impossible to excavate. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the people of the ancient Nile Valley were more innovative, more adaptable, and more capable of rapid cultural transformation than we often assume. Maybe when environmental pressures forced them to either evolve quickly or perish, they chose to evolve and did so with such success that it now seems almost unbelievable. Either way, when you stand before the pyramids, you are witnessing the outcome of a process we still do not fully understand. A transition from small settlements to a highly complex civilization that occurred faster and more completely than almost anywhere else in the ancient world. The pre-dynastic gap remains one of archaeology's most fascinating mysteries, and somewhere beneath the sands of the Sahara, or waiting in some unexplored corner of Egypt, the missing pieces of this story may still be hidden, waiting to be discovered. You are part of a flourishing hunter-gatherer community 12,900 years ago. Your people have thrived for thousands of years. The Ice Age is coming to an end. For 7,000 years, glaciers have been retreating. Temperatures are rising, sea levels are climbing, and life is becoming more manageable. Your ancestors have learned how to hunt large megafauna, how to process wild grains, and how to construct semi-permanent shelters. Some of your settlements include hundreds of individuals. You maintain trade networks that stretch across hundreds of miles. You create art, observe the skies, and build monuments. You are standing at the edge of something transformative, perhaps the beginning of agriculture, perhaps the rise of cities, perhaps even the invention of writing. And then, within the span of a single human lifetime, everything unravels completely. At first, the shift is barely noticeable. Winters grow harsher, summers become shorter. But within one generation, something extraordinary takes place. The global climate doesn't merely cool, it collapses entirely. Temperatures plunge back into full glacial conditions, not over thousands of years as expected, but within mere decades. The glaciers that had been retreating for 7,000 years suddenly advance once more. Forests begin to wither and die. Grasslands transform into frozen tundra. The megafauna you have relied on for millennia begin to disappear, not just in isolated regions, but across entire continents. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears all vanish within only a few centuries. Your settlements, the permanent villages your people had carefully established over generations, can no longer be sustained. Food sources begin to fail. The herds have vanished. The wild grain fields no longer produce. Starvation spreads. Some groups attempt to migrate, searching for regions less affected by the collapse. Others struggle to adapt, trying to survive on whatever limited resources remain. Many do not succeed. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals a severe population collapse. Not 1,280 individuals like the ancient bottleneck, but still devastating in scale. Cultures that had flourished for thousands of years simply disappear from the record. Their settlements are abandoned, their tool-making traditions cease, and their accumulated knowledge fades away. This was not legend. This was not guesswork. This was the Younger Dryas, and it endured for 1,300 years. Now here is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Before the Younger Dryas, during what archaeologists call the Alarud period, humans were not merely surviving, they were prospering. Evidence from this era suggests societies were far more advanced than we once believed possible for hunter-gatherers. Consider the Natufian culture in the Levant. These people were constructing permanent stone dwellings 15,000 years ago, not temporary shelters, but year-round villages featuring mortared walls, plastered floors, and storage facilities. They harvested wild grains with such efficiency that they developed specialized tools, sickle blades, marked by silica polish from cutting countless stalks, grinding stones for turning seeds into flour, and storage pits to preserve surplus grain through winter months. They were practicing nearly all aspects of agriculture except the actual planting of crops. They had achieved sedentary living through intensive foraging, and they were not alone. In North America, the Clovis culture flourished highly skilled big-game hunters with a distinctive stone tool technology found across the entire continent. They were not scattered, aimless nomads. They were organized, mobile groups capable of coordinating large-scale hunts and maintaining technological traditions across thousands of miles. In Europe, Magdalenian hunter-gatherers were creating cave art of astonishing sophistication, unmatched for 10,000 years. The paintings at Lascaux and Altamira are not crude sketches. They are vivid, naturalistic portrayals of animals, demonstrating an understanding of perspective, movement, and anatomy. The people who created this art had leisure time, specialized roles, and complex symbolic systems. They possessed culture in every meaningful sense of the word. Then the younger Dryas arrived, and much of it vanished. Yet some structures endured, and these remnants are forcing us to completely reconsider what we thought we understood about civilization. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, when uncovered in the 1990s, transformed archaeology. The site is 11,600 years old, placing it at the end of the Younger Dryas, before agriculture, before pottery, before settled civilization as we define it. But it is not a simple settlement. It is a monumental complex of massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures and decorated with intricate carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and human figures. Constructing this required coordinating hundreds of people, quarrying limestone, transporting enormous blocks without wheels or draft animals, and carving detailed reliefs using only stone tools. According to the old model, hunter-gatherers should not have been capable of such achievements. The traditional view holds that agriculture must come first, then surplus food, then specialized labor, and only then monumental architecture. But Göbekli Tepe reverses that sequence. The monuments came first, built by people who were still hunting gazelles and gathering wild plants. They had not yet developed agriculture, or had they? Because here is the key point. Göbekli Tepe did not emerge suddenly. The construction methods, symbolic systems, and social organization required to build it must have taken time to evolve, generations, at the very least, likely centuries. This implies the existence of predecessors, earlier experiments, simpler structures, and a gradual accumulation of the knowledge and skills necessary to create something as complex as Göbekli Tepe. But where did they go? If they had existed prior to the Younger Dryas, much of the physical evidence would now lie hidden beneath 1,300 years of environmental upheaval. Settlements left behind, buildings reduced to ruin, organic remains broken down over time, and that only accounts for what once stood on land. Now consider the oceans. During the peak of the last ice age, sea levels were about 400 feet lower than they are today. That represents the equivalent of a 40-story building's height of water locked away in massive ice sheets. The outlines of the continents were entirely different. What is now submerged continental shelf was once exposed land, covering millions of square miles of livable terrain where humans could have settled. And coastlines, as we know, are some of the most valuable places to inhabit, full of resources, with mild climates and natural pathways for movement. If complex hunter-gatherer societies existed before the Younger Dryas, they would likely have been concentrated along these coastal regions. Then the Ice Age ended, and sea levels rose those 400 feet over the course of several thousand years. As a result, those coastal settlements would have been swallowed by the sea, their buildings submerged, their tools dispersed, and their traces effectively erased. An entire world may now lie lost beneath the ocean. This leads to a difficult question. How advanced were these vanished coastal cultures? The conventional view holds that they were hunter-gatherers, perhaps sophisticated ones, but still essentially primitive. But what if that assumption is incomplete? What if some groups had developed forms of knowledge we do not expect, including advanced astronomy, complex mathematics, or even early metallurgy? The capacity was certainly there. These people possessed brains identical to ours. They had been refining survival strategies for hundreds of thousands of years. They experienced thousands of years of relative stability before the Younger Dryas. Why would innovation not have emerged? This is where the discussion becomes controversial. Some researchers, most notably Graham Hancock, have suggested that an advanced civilization existed during the Ice Age before the Younger Dryas. Not extraterrestrial, not mythical Atlantis, but human. A culture that may have developed sophisticated technologies, perhaps even seafaring abilities, and constructed monumental architecture, much of which was later destroyed by climatic catastrophe and rising seas. The evidence cited includes unusual megalithic sites across the world, the enormous stone blocks at Baalbek in Lebanon, some weighing over 800 tons, the highly precise stonework at Pumapunku in Bolivia, the underwater formations near Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan, and the submerged ruins discovered near Dwarka along the coast of India. Mainstream archaeology tends to dismiss most of these examples as either natural formations, mistaken for human-made structures, or as constructions far younger than claimed, and in many cases that assessment is likely correct. However, the dismissal can sometimes feel too quick because we do know certain things with confidence. We know that complex hunter-gatherer societies existed. Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that clearly. We know that large portions of land were submerged as sea levels rose. We know that the Younger Dryas caused a dramatic population collapse that would have erased much of the archaeological record. And we know that our ancestors were just as intelligent as we are today. So, how can we be entirely certain there was nothing more? Then there is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, perhaps the most controversial aspect of all. Some scientists have argued that the abrupt beginning of the Younger Dryas was not caused by normal climatic variation, but by a cosmic event, a comet or asteroid breaking apart in the atmosphere and detonating over the ice sheets, triggering sudden and severe cooling. The evidence put forward includes a thin layer of sediment dated to around 12,800 years ago, containing unusual materials. Nanodiamonds formed only under extreme heat and pressure, magnetic spherules, indicating widespread fires, elevated concentrations of platinum group elements that are rare on Earth's surface but common in extraterrestrial objects, and shocked quartz crystals that bear the signature of impact forces. Many geologists remain skeptical. They argue that the evidence is not definitive, that these materials could have alternative explanations, and that no clear impact crater from the correct time period has been identified. Yet the debate continues, because if such an event did occur, then any advanced societies present at that time would have faced a dual disaster: immediate devastation from the impact itself, including tsunamis, wildfires, and atmospheric debris, followed by 1,300 years of climatic instability. That combination would be more than sufficient to erase a civilization almost completely. The extinction record supports the idea of something catastrophic. During the Younger Dryas, most Ice Age megafauna disappeared around the world. In North America alone, 35 genera of large animals vanished. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and short-faced bears all disappeared. Many of these species had endured multiple earlier climate changes over millions of years, yet they did not survive this one, and neither did the Clovis culture. The recognizable Clovis tool tradition vanishes from the archaeological record precisely at the onset of the Younger Dryas. The people themselves did not disappear, but their culture did. Whatever social organization and body of knowledge had enabled them to spread across an entire continent broke down. This pattern shows up across the world. Complex cultures existing before 12,800 years ago, followed by a gap in the archaeological record, and then simpler cultures emerging again after the Younger Dryas ended 11,600 years ago. It is as if a reset switch was pressed on human cultural development, not a total extinction, but a disruption severe enough that much accumulated knowledge and social complexity were lost. When societies began to rebuild after the Younger Dryas, people had to rediscover skills their ancestors may already have mastered, and some knowledge may have disappeared forever. This marks one of humanity's greatest historical blind spots. We possess fairly solid archaeological evidence, reaching back about 10,000 years to the dawn of settled agriculture and the first cities. Before that, the record becomes increasingly fragmented, and the Younger Dryas sits right at that dividing line. Everything prior to it is more difficult to locate, more difficult to interpret, and more likely to have been erased. We are attempting to piece together human history with a 1,300-year catastrophe positioned directly in the middle of one of the most crucial periods. It is like trying to read a book where 100 pages have been torn out at the climax. What exactly was lost? Perhaps nothing beyond hunter-gatherer camps and simple tool traditions. Or perhaps something far more significant: astronomical knowledge refined over thousands of years of observation, mathematical systems advanced enough to predict seasonal cycles and track celestial movements, oral traditions preserving accounts of human migrations and environmental shifts, possibly even early systems of writing or symbolic notation that left no surviving trace in the archaeological record. We may never know with certainty. The evidence lies buried beneath layers of sediment, submerged under rising seas, or destroyed during 1,300 years of climatic upheaval. Yet the gaps remain, and within those gaps lies space for questions that make mainstream archaeologists uneasy. Because one thing is clear: our ancestors were not primitive. They were intelligent, adaptable, and capable of complex cultural achievements even without agriculture or cities. They endured the Younger Dryas, reconstructed their societies, and eventually formed the civilizations we recognize today. But what they created before that, what knowledge they may have possessed and then lost, remains concealed within the largest gap in human history. And often, the questions we cannot answer are more compelling than those we can. The Younger Dryas came to an end 11,600 years ago. Ice sheets retreated once more, temperatures rose, and within a few thousand years, the first true civilizations emerged: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley. Yet they did not arise from nothing. They were built upon knowledge and techniques that must have developed over millennia. And some of that knowledge may have been extremely ancient, preserved through catastrophe, and passed down across generations, waiting for stable conditions to flourish again. We are all descendants of those who survived, inheritors of cultures that endured the most severe climate disaster of the last 100,000 years, and carriers of whatever knowledge they managed to preserve through that darkness. So here we are at the conclusion of this journey through the gaps, the voids, the missing centuries that mark human history like holes in ancient parchment, and in truth, we have not solved anything. The Bronze Age collapse remains unexplained. We still do not know what became of the Indus Valley civilization, The Dark Ages remain frustratingly obscure. Pre-Columbian America still guards many of its secrets. And those Pacific voyagers, they remain somewhere within the haze of history, their stories still waiting to be uncovered. But this is the nature of mysteries. They do not need to be resolved to have value. There is something profoundly important in recognizing what we do not know, because every gap in our understanding is an invitation, a reminder that history is not a finished book, but an ongoing investigation in which each generation takes part. Consider it this way. Anyone who claims to know exactly what happened in the past is mistaken, not necessarily out of deception, but because they are filling in the gaps with assumptions, with guesses presented as certainty. The honest approach, the scientific approach, is to say we do not know yet. And that word yet carries weight, because our ability to investigate continues to improve. Technologies that did not exist 20 years ago are transforming archaeology today. Ground-penetrating radar that can reveal entire buried cities without disturbing a single stone. DNA analysis that traces ancient migrations with a precision our predecessors could never have imagined. Satellite imagery that uncovers landscape alterations invisible from the ground, and climate proxies that reconstruct ancient weather patterns season by season. Every new instrument or method sheds light on yet another hidden part of the unknown. Even in just the past few years, we have uncovered entire civilizations that no one previously realized had ever existed. LiDAR scans in the Amazon exposed vast urban settlements in regions where researchers once believed only small, scattered tribes had lived. Exploration of the deep ocean revealed shipwrecks that forced us to rethink ancient trade systems. Studies of ice cores pushed the timeline of human presence in the Americas back by thousands of years. Each of these findings demanded that textbooks be rewritten, that we acknowledge how incomplete our previous understanding was, and that process will continue. Someone hearing this right now, perhaps you, could be the person who makes the next major breakthrough, not necessarily by uncovering a lost object in a dramatic dig. It might come from asking a question no one else considered. It might come from using a new technology to approach an old issue. It might come from examining familiar evidence from a completely different perspective and noticing patterns others overlooked. Because these gaps are not barriers, they are possibilities. Every empty space in the historical record is an opening for future researchers to leave their mark. Every unresolved mystery is a puzzle waiting for someone insightful enough, patient enough, and curious enough to assemble it. These missing eras are not gone forever. They are only missing for now. And there is something reassuring in that idea, isn't there? In a world that often feels entirely charted, fully explored, with no new frontiers left to discover, history reminds us that mystery still remains, that wonder is still alive, that we are still only at the beginning of understanding our own story as a species. We have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, yet we have uncovered only small fragments of our past. The rest is still waiting. So, what should you take from all of this? Perhaps just the realization that certainty is overrated, that the most fascinating questions are the ones we cannot yet answer, that each generation builds upon the last, seeing just a little further into the unknown, and that your place in this ongoing search truly matters. Whether you are a professional archaeologist or simply someone who finds this subject captivating at 2 a.m., your curiosity adds to the collective effort to understand where we come from. If you have stayed with me this far, If even a small part of these mysteries has sparked your imagination, do me a favor and leave a comment telling me where you are listening from. Are you in the Americas? On land where ancient civilizations once flourished? In Europe, where the shadow of the Dark Ages lingered? Somewhere in Africa, where so much of our earliest history is still unwritten? Or out in the Pacific, on islands reached by explorers whose names have faded from memory? Your location is part of this story too, part of the ongoing human journey we are all trying to understand. Press that like button if you enjoyed reflecting on these mysteries with me. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring the hidden corners of history together, because there are always more gaps to examine, more lost eras to uncover, more shadows between the known chapters of our story. And if you are drifting off to sleep right now, let these mysteries travel with you into your dreams. Picture those Bronze Age cities in their final hours. Imagine the navigators of the Pacific reading the stars. Think about the people of the Indus Valley living their everyday lives in a civilization we are only beginning to comprehend. The past is still out there, waiting, and so is the future of discovery. Sleep well.